I'm going to leave you with a question today. Literally, we will end our service asking you a question, and I will send you out to think about it. It's not a complicated question. It's a fairly easy question to answer. It's a yes or no answer. But that doesn't mean it's not provocative and challenging. It's a question that is sourced in this idea that we want to make a difference. And if we want to make a difference, we want to be different on purpose. We want to be different to that end. In a world of chaos, we want to be a people of grace. We want to be counter to the culture of division and destruction. And we envision being a community that is characterized by this. The way that we say it is we envision ourselves as a welcoming community. That simply means that we welcome you no matter what your background is, no matter where you are in your journey. We'll welcome you just as you are, right where you are. And we are a welcoming community that is dedicated in service to others, in service to each other and to others across our city, across our borders, around our world. And we do all of this because we are compelled by grace, because we wish to be a people of grace. This vision is not our own. This is not something we conjured up. It may be something that we crafted semantically. But the DNA of this vision goes back to the founding of this church. In fact, it goes back to the founding of the church. It goes back 2,000 years. Goes back to the very first church and to the architecture of grace that was established in the early church. The book, or the letter, that represents perhaps the most detailed architecture of the theology of grace is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Rome. We have it in our Bibles as the book of Romans. In the first 11 chapters of that book, the Apostle Paul lays out at a doctoral level in great detail the architecture of grace. And he comes to what we have as the end of the 11th chapter, and he prays a prayer. And the prayer is based on the sovereignty of God, and it is an acknowledgement that the only way that we can be recipients of grace is because God chooses so. God made grace so that we could enjoy it. And we are called to be a people of grace. And then what happens is, at the beginning of what we have as the 12th chapter of the book of Romans, he says, therefore, because of all of these things, because of the history and the architecture of grace, therefore, I urge you, my brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, in view of the maternal compassion of God, in view of the grace and the love of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. If you were here last week, you heard Stephanie Rollins brilliantly remind us that we are a people who are under the influence of a spiritual schizophrenia, of a Platonic duality. We are people who are raised philosophically and culturally to believe that we can bifurcate our lives, and then we have this binary existence between the spiritual and the material, between the physical and the metaphysical. But the Apostle Paul is telling us that if we are to be a people of grace, it involves us embodying that grace in all that we are and all that we do as we present ourselves as a living sacrifice. And this is holy and pleasing to God, because this is what constitutes true and proper worship. Next week, we will examine how we go about in presenting ourselves and how that happens. And it happens by changing our minds. That we are not conformed to the pattern of this world, he says in verse 2, but we are transformed by the renewal of our minds, not by focusing on what we should be or what we ought to be or what we were, but being renewed into something that we could be, that we could possibly be. To be change agents, to bring peace in a chaotic world, to be people who make a difference by the renewing of our mind. And then he says, and then you will know what God's will is for you, what God's purpose is for you. In our final week, we'll wrestle with, why am I here? What is our purpose? What is our meaning? And the promise of being a people of grace is it gives us purpose and it gives us meaning. Because we will know what God's will is, we will be able to test and approve it. Not just God's will, but God's good and pleasing and perfect will. But today I want to back up. I want to back up to that phrase at the end of Romans 12:1, where it says, this is your true and proper worship. And I want us to wrestle with what it means to truly worship. Now, I got to take a deep breath before we dive in on this, because these are deep waters. But if you don't mind, take a breath and pause to pray. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, and that you would use your word spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge us to truly be a people of grace who understand what it means to worship. Pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here. For I ask this in Jesus' name, amen. I'm not proud of this, but I have been fired from my pastoral ministry 2 times. In fact, I was fired 2 times in the first 5 years of my full-time professional ministry by the same church. And I didn't leave. I stayed there another 12 years. Now, I have to clarify when I say that I was fired. I wasn't technically fired. I was asked to resign, to which I politely said, no. And the context of the first one was formal. The elders came together and they said, there are a group of the people in the church who feel like it would be appropriate if you were to resign. And I said, I don't feel that's what God is calling me to do. And 2 years later, there was another sort of jihad, gossipy uprising of people that said maybe we should ask him to resign. And I impolitely and directly told them, no, I don't feel like that's what I should do. And the interesting thing is, in both cases, the thing that ignited the controversy was exactly the same. The thing that triggered this disagreement and this disapproval and this dissatisfaction was how we were doing worship on Sunday mornings. Now, if you've been around church any length of time, you realize that that happens all the time in almost every church. In fact, that's why there are thousands of different churches. It's not simply because we have disagreements about spirituality or morality. Certainly, it's not simply because we have contextual disagreements over theology. Most of the time, churches are divided and people leave and go and come and go from churches basically over style, over the form of the experience on Sunday morning. It is the most controversial, most emotional, most difficult subject for the church to come together on. And it's completely understandable because genuine worship is supposed to be vulnerable, and genuine worship is supposed to be meaningful. And so our expectations and our prejudices and our perceptions really shape what we feel is right or wrong. But what is worship supposed to be? What should it be? Well, fortunately for us, we don't have to guess. In Romans chapter 12, at the end of verse 1, the Apostle Paul could not possibly say it more plainly. He says, this is your true and proper worship. This is what it is. But all you have to do is rewind the verse just a little bit to find out what he means when he said, this is your true and proper worship. He says, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is true and proper worship. Now that made sense for the Apostle Paul. It made perfect sense for the Apostle Paul. Because the Apostle Paul was a professionally trained rabbi. He had been trained in the rabbinic teachings and in the ways of Torah law and of the Mishnah and all of the traditions of the rabbis since he was a child. And until he had a head-on collision with the resurrected Jesus on the road to Damascus, his path was to be a Pharisee of Pharisees. In fact, in his life story in Acts chapters 21 and 22, he is in Jerusalem, and the Jews there are trying to lynch him. And they were going to put him to death. Except for the Romans stepped in and they arrested him for causing a riot. And Paul asked them, can I talk to them? And he gets up in front of the Jewish accusers, the people who wanted literally to put him to death. And he said, I'm a Jew just like you. I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees. I'm trained in the law. I'm a rabbi. I know what I'm talking about. You see, the Apostle Paul had been trained in the protocols and the liturgies and the traditions of worship. And the worship in the Torah law was all about sacrifice. It was all about the altar and the offerings. It wouldn't surprise me at all if the Apostle Paul had the entire book of Leviticus memorized. Certainly the first seven chapters of the book of Leviticus are a detailed instruction for the people of Israel on how to worship. You worship at the altar. You worship by bringing your offerings. And in sacrifice, this is where worship takes place. In Leviticus chapter 16, the entire chapter is devoted to the Day of Atonement, where the people of God came together and made offerings and made sacrifices to pay for the sins of the nation and the sins of the world. And so for the Apostle Paul, the association between worship and sacrifice is inseparable. So you could say very easily that true and proper worship is, above all other things, sacrificial. This is how Paul understood it. That offering is not about what we get, but what we give. It's not about what we receive, but what we offer. Worship is about sacrifice. Now that's a slippery slope. That's a razor's edge. There's a paradox there. Because if all worship involves sacrifice, if all worship is sacrifice, we also know that not all sacrifice is worship. If sacrifice is required, if sacrifice is an obligation, if sacrifice is mandated, it is not worship. When you pay your taxes, you're not worshiping the government. You're simply obeying what they are demanding that you do. Sometimes we sacrifice because we have to, because we're required to. But worship is volitional sacrifice. We sacrifice because we choose to. We make an offering. We sacrifice ourselves as a living offering. So how do we do it? What are the attributes of a living sacrifice? I think there are two that transcend all of the boundaries of time and practice. And they're applicable to us here at Riverbend, and they're applicable to everyone who desires to worship God. And there are two very easy ones. The first one is gratitude. Volitional, true and proper sacrificial worship is characterized by thankfulness, by gratitude. We know that it's true. We know that if your attitude is not one of thankfulness, if you do not have an attitude of gratitude, your offering is compromised. If we begrudgingly say, yeah, okay, God, I give it to you, I surrender, it's not the same as if, I'm privileged to have the opportunity. I'm privileged to have the time, to have the space, to have the resources, to have the health, to have the strength, to have the clarity of mind, to be able to give this away, to be able to make an offering to you. I had to have it to give it, and I'm thankful that I had it. That attitude of thankfulness is embedded in the instructions in worship throughout the New Testament. In Ephesians chapter 5, it's talking about worshiping and singing and talking about making music to the Lord with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And the qualifier in all of that is always giving thanks to God. It says almost the same thing in Colossians chapter 3. In Colossians chapter 3, it's talking about edifying each other and admonishing each other and teaching with all wisdom. But it's in the context of being thankful, with gratitude in our hearts toward God. That's how we offer ourselves to learn. That's how we offer ourselves to worship, with an attitude of gratitude. In the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 12, there's an interesting passage where it says, therefore, in light of the assurance that we have of our hope of salvation, in light of these things, we are to worship God with reverence and awe in the context of thankfulness, of gratitude. And it's interesting there in Hebrews chapter 12 that the author adds a parenthetical note. It says, it's because our God is a consuming fire. And it's important. It's Deuteronomy 4 that he's quoting, and what he's basically saying there is God burns off the BS. God is not fooled by your pretend, your faux gratitude. Give God the sincere thanks. That is the attribute of volitional, sacrificial, true and proper worship. If the first element of true and proper worship is gratitude, the second element is generosity. It makes sense, doesn't it? That if worship is not about giving, it's about getting. If worship is the thing that we offer, not the thing that we receive, generosity is intrinsic in the expression of worship. That means that when you give your money, when you sacrifice the money that you have earned or the wealth that you have, you are worshiping. You are expressing an offering. It's not what I have, but what I give. It's true of your time. It's true of your time. It's true when you're here on Sunday mornings. I know that right now there are literally thousands of people watching online, and they're giving their time. But yeah, I can tell you how much it means to have you in the room. You may say, nobody notices me. So many of you sit in the same seats I notice when you're not here. And you don't even know that you may just walk by a person who perhaps is a neighbor you didn't realize, or a friend who you hadn't seen in a while, or someone who sees someone who looks like them, who is their age, who has their struggles, or someone who they identify with, and you just being here, just giving your time is an offering. And it qualifies as worship. It's generous with our time. I think it is our most precious commodity. Money is easy to give. Time is much harder. It's much more of a sincere offering. So that when you serve, when you're serving, you're worshiping. You ever think when you're making coffee for the folks here at Riverbend, you're worshiping? When you're driving a golf cart, you're worshiping? Whether you can believe it or not, when you are working with middle schoolers, you are worshiping because they will scare the hell out of you. And it's a worship experience to think that there's life in these little human beings. It's worship to serve. Yesterday, all across our campus, there were dozens of men. I don't know if you noticed it, but they were mowing the grass and trimming trees and planting flowers, and they were worshiping in the dirt. Because when we serve, we worship. I know. There are seasons when we can't, when we don't have it, when the burdens and the bruises and the struggle of life is so great that I've got nothing to give. I just need to come and heal. I know that on a regular basis there are folks that are finding their way here because they've run the string. They're out of hope. And they just need to come, and they need to sit, and they need to be fed, and they need to just rest, and that's okay. There are times when we say, I've been doing this my whole life, man. I need a Sabbath. I need a break. I've been there and done that over and over and over, and I just need a season where it can be for me, and that's okay. But if any of you have had a medical procedure in the last 20 years, you know the annoying thing about recovery is they get you up as soon as they can. And they move you around, and they make you move, because you don't heal best just laying there. You heal best by moving. And I promise you, the best gift that you have to give someone is the journey that you have already been on. Because they may be on the front end where you are on the back end. And you can say, I can walk with you. You're going to be okay. I've been there and I've done that. See, generosity is this aspect of volitional and sacrificial worship that purifies it. It's not about what I get, it's about what I give. It's also covered over in gratitude. See, I have a theory, and I haven't exactly worked it out yet. But I believe that we worship what we sacrifice most for, which should be convicting, because I read a study that made a calculation about 18-year-olds. If you're 18 years old today in 2024, and you live to be 75 years old, there are people who have calculated how many hours you will spend sleeping, how many hours you will spend eating, how many hours you will spend sitting in traffic, how many hours you will spend working, how many hours you will spend in relationship with friends, how many hours you will spend in between all of those things. And you know what the number one thing an 18-year-old today will spend the majority of their time on by the time they are 75 years old? And it's not even close. Looking at a screen. What you sacrifice for is the thing that you worship, because worship is sacrifice. The Apostle Paul understood this. He was a rabbi. He was trained in the law of Moses. He knew Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He probably had the whole Torah memorized. He understood that the worship the people of God were commanded to express was a sacrificial worship. It's centered around the altar and offerings. That's who they were. That's what they did. But he was advocating for a different kind of worship. As a people of grace, he was advocating for a different kind of sacrifice. In the Bible, there's a book called the Book of Hebrews, and the Book of Hebrews was not written by the Apostle Paul, but it was written for the Apostle Paul. In fact, it was written for anyone who was struggling to understand a new way to worship. The book of Hebrews was written to help people like Paul, to help people who had one form of worship as their lifetime of expression, to understand that there's a new way to worship. In the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 10, it says, therefore, because we have this this opportunity to come boldly before the throne of God, to enter into his grace, because we have this permission, this access to God, we should do three things. It's let us. It says, let us draw near to God. And then it says, let us hold unswervingly to the hope that we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And then he says, let us consider how we might spur one another on to love and good deeds, and to not forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as some are in the habit of doing, but to encourage one another, even more as you see the day approaching. That we have a responsibility to each other, to encourage each other to sacrificial, volitional, true, and proper worship. We do that by doing it together, by being together, by leaning on each other, by setting the example of what that sacrifice looks like. It's not just do as I say, it's do as I do. And then he says there's an urgency to it, even all the more as you see the day approaching. And I understand that. Totally understand that urgency. See, that's what got me in trouble early in my ministry. When I was 31 years old, I was all worked up. I was all impatient. I was all in a hurry to get things done. And part of it was my theological training. See, I was trained as a premillennial theologian. For those of you who don't know what premillennialism is the theological interpretation of the eschatology, or the prophecy in the Bible, that says Jesus will return before the kingdom of God is established on earth, before the millennium, premillennial. Now, there are other forms of eschatological interpretation. There's amillennial interpretation, which believes that the kingdom of heaven is metaphorical. The kingdom of heaven is happening now. It is among us. It's a metaphor. There are post-millennial theologians who believe that Jesus will come back after we're done establishing the kingdom. But as a premillennialist, one of the key doctrines of premillennialism is the doctrine of imminency. And the doctrine of imminency basically says Jesus could come back now. There doesn't have to be any setup. There doesn't have to be any warning. There may be some indications, but the earth has always been ready. And so you take an impetuous, impatient 31-year-old young man and you put him in a situation with a theology that says tomorrow is not something you can bargain with. And I say we got to grow and we got to change and we got to do it now. And we got to do it in a hurry because we don't have time to wait. And you see, what I didn't know was how to manage change. See, I understood that all growth requires change. You could say it as all growth is change, but not all change is growth. And I didn't understand the second part. So I let my impatience and my sense of urgency run ahead of where the people were that I was supposed to shepherd into the process. And so in my impatience and in my theological sense of urgency, I left without them. And I don't want to do that here. Do I believe that we have to grow and change? Absolutely. Do I believe that we have a sense of urgency? Not simply because of my premillennial inclinations, but because I've seen life. And life doesn't wait for us. And I've looked around at the culture, and the chaos that I see is not getting any better. And if we are going to be a people who make a difference, and we are called to be, if we are called to be a people of grace in a world of chaos and division and destruction, then we need to pursue that to the best that we can today, not tomorrow, not 10 years from now, today. And so I would invite you to join me on that journey, because I'm not going to go without you. But the invitation isn't mine. I'm not the one extending the invitation. The invitation is 2,000 years old. It was an invitation that the Apostle Paul gave to the church at Rome, that he gives to us, the church at Riverbend. He says, therefore, because God has chosen to make us aware of grace, because God in his sovereignty has poured out his grace on us. Therefore, I urge you with a sense of impatience, my brothers and sisters, my fellow Riverbenders, my friends and family, I urge you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice that is holy and pleasing to God, because this is what true and proper worship is. And don't be conformed to the chaos of the world. Don't let it overwhelm you. Don't get buried in the division and the arguments and the backstabbing and the cutting and the gossiping and the turmoil of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, by understanding who we could be, the difference that we could make. And then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. You'll know why we're here. You'll know your purpose. You know that your life has meaning, that you're making a difference, because you'll know God's good and pleasing and perfect will. This is our vision. This is what we hope to be. This is what we aspire to be as a community. A welcoming community in service to others, compelled by the idea of God's grace. So the question that I leave you with today is a simple question. It's yes or no. And I want you to leave considering this. Will you join me? Will you join me in this pursuit of what it means to be a people of grace? Will you join me in true and proper worship? I ask you today to come with me and join me. As you leave today, I want you to keep that question in mind. And if you have questions and you'd like to ask someone about what it means to be in that relationship with Christ, what it means to be a part of Riverbend, what it means to be a person of grace, where it is that we keep the donuts. You just find a person with one of these lanyards on. They'll be on the mezzanine, they'll be in the plaza, they'll be as you're coming and going, and they're there every week to process the questions you have with you. So I leave you with the question, will you join me? Thanks for being here. Have a great week. See you next Sunday.